I stood there, numb with shock, watching as the last bit of life drained from the small body in front of me. As a werewolf, I've seen plenty of violence, but never anything as cruel as the murder of an innocent child. His heart torn out. Chapter 13. I stood there, numb with shock, as I watched the last vestiges of life leave the small body on the ground in front of me. The seconds passed by, and part of me knew that my wolf was howling at me, urging me to snap out of my trance. But I cowed and turned my eyes away from the grotesque sight. As a werewolf, I had seen plenty of violence in my lifetime, but never had I witnessed something like this, the brutal slaying of a boy that was but a child. Judging by the size of the hole in his chest, his heart had been ripped clean from his body. That was one of the only ways to kill a werewolf. I registered all of this in mere seconds, and it was then that my instincts kicked in. I quickly sank into a defensive position, tearing my eyes away from the body as I slowly turned in a circle. The attack had been fast and silent, faster than even my werewolf vision could detect. My eyes bored into the trees as I sought the attacker. In the darkness of early night, my wolf senses aided me, but still I detected no movement other than the swaying of branches and the rustling of leaves. As I was examining our surroundings, Bree's shrill scream had turned more into a gurgling wail before she quickly clapped her hands to her mouth, stifling the noise as she sank to her knees in front of Riley's corpse. Her sides heaved and she was seemingly unaware of the possible danger as she sobbed. I narrowed my eyes, frustrated. My nose detected nothing, but I didn't expect to smell the vampire. Gabriel had said they were almost impossible to track. Still, that did not stop me from forcing down my nausea and seeking the creature that did this to an innocent child. I wanted to tear it limb from limb. Seeing nothing, no enemy to attack, my eyes inevitably wandered back to the scene in front of me. Bree was hunched over Riley's from as a high. Keening noise escaped her throat. I dimly realized that warmth was still trickling down my face and front as Riley's blood stuck to my skin. I fought down the bile that threatened to rise. I ate. Bree stammered, looking up at me with bloodshot eyes. It struck me how even a good fighter like her could look so broken and vulnerable. What? She whispered, her voice breaking. I shook my head. It happened so fast, I said softly, trying to reassure her, but I cowed and helped the guilt that arose. If we wouldn't have taken so long to get back to camp, then again, if we had hurried, we would never have met up with Riley in the first place. Had our presence even made a difference? What kind of vampire could get past a strong werewolves and kill another in an instant without being detected? It had to be far stronger than those I had previously encountered. Questions continued to assault my brain as I wondered why it had attacked us in a group, and then left Bree and me alive. In the distance I registered shouting, and my wolf hearing picked up rapid footsteps. They no doubt heard the screaming, or Bree had mentally contacted them. Tilting my head, I inhaled. Deeply I recognized Gabriel. Eli, another scent I faintly recognized. And then one I didn't. I stood there, my body beginning to shake from suppressed emotion as I kept my gaze averted from the mangled body. The stench of blood hung heavily in the air, and I cowed and kept Riley's lifeless eyes out of my mind. The vacancy in them that indicated that both he and his wolf were gone forever. I felt sick. Moments later, the incoming group burst through the trees towards us, Gabriel ahead of the others. He took one look at the corpse before his expression hardened, a look of visible fury entering his dark eyes. A second later, his gaze flipped to me, taking in my bloodied appearance. Immediately, he looked alarmed, and I realized that he probably thought I was injured. The instincts of a wolf protecting his mate must have kicked in, for he leapt over Riley and Bree in one smooth motion and landed in front of me. I felt my wolf whining at his proximity and my nerves tingled, but I could only stare up at him blankly. The images of Riley's face on repeat inside my head. Gabriel's eyes were as dark as I had ever seen them, and there was a multitude of emotions churning in them. But he was gentle as he raised his hand and gripped my chin. I felt my body sizzle at the contact as I distantly realized it was the first time Hed willingly touched me. He delicately turned my face to the side, examining the blood, before his gaze traveled down to my shirt. "Are you injured?" Or is this all his blood? His keen sense of smell letting him know that the blood was not mine, but his wolf probably wanting to make sure. I felt my shaking abate slightly. No, it's all his, I choked out. What happened? His gaze was still dangerous, but his voice was soft. I saw Eli and Ava crouch down beside Bree, Eva's eyes shining with unshed tears as she looked at Riley. Vampire, I managed to whisper, my voice feeling as if it was caught in my throat. Gabriel released my chin and I suddenly felt colder. He gritted his teeth, his fists clenching at his sides. Bree and I cowered. I tried to explain, although the revolting images made it difficult for me to think. It moved faster than the others. By the time I felt movement, it was too late. I felt tears threatening in the back of my eyes, but I pushed them away. It was my own pack member, but it was a young child, and despite the tragedy, I had to be strong. Gabriel turned over his shoulder and his eyes met Ali's. Both of them looked grim, but surprised. Bree was still crying softly as Ava tried to comfort her. A werewolf I hadn't seen before knelt next to Riley. His face shadowed. You were supposed to be back by sunset, Gabriel said, voice tight. I felt another wave of guilt. Even though I knew it wasn't my fault, I lowered my head to stare at the ground. I told Vincent to have you back by then. His voice was louder now, taut with anger. It isn't his fault, I said quietly. The pace was too fast. Bree and I had to slow down. When we were almost back, she smelled Riley, and we waited for him to join us. By the time we set off again, it was dark. She didn't want him out here hunting alone. The words were rushing out now as I rambled. And then we were almost back and I felt movement, and the next thing I knew his body was falling to the ground and... Skylar, Gabriel said, cutting me off. To my agent extraordinaire, Madeleine Nilban, heartfelt thanks for your unfailing patience, enthusiasm. From a mix of fear and his use of my name, Eli is going to take you back to the house. He was back to his emotional self, his tone leaving no room for argument. But I started to protest. I was sure why I was arguing. I just felt partially responsible and I didn't want to walk away. No, Wolf should be out at night. It could come back any moment, and since I have to take care of this, I can't be watching you every second to make sure you're safe. I bristled, not liking his implication that I was a child that needed constant watching. Then again, every time I was away from him something seemed to happen. Despite his tone, I thought I saw a hint of something in his expression. Guilt. Maybe. I felt the hair on the back of my neck stand up as I wondered. Was it just coincidence that the vampire had attacked the group I was in? I shook away the disturbing thoughts. But I was here. I could help explain what happened. The thought of recounting the tale horrified me and I faltered. Stop arguing, he replied, irritation evident in his voice now. Eli, he barked, and the beta stood up to make his way over to us. Take her to my house. I'll send someone there to guard her. Then come straight back so we can take care of this. His eyes bored into Al, his impression that they were having a silent exchange of words. I nodded, and I was annoyed at the concept of Gabriel sending a babysitter to watch me. I didn't argue. To my agent extraordinaire, Madeleine Nilban, heartfelt thanks for your unfailing patience, enthusiasm. My stomach was churning and I was worried if I didn't get away from the smell of death soon I would faint. Never had I seen such a thing in almost 20 years. My wolf, too, was sickened. It was all worsened by the fact that it happened to someone so vulnerable and innocent. I gritted my teeth as Eli set off, me trailing behind. I glanced back over my shoulder, my eyes skimming over the bloody scene. Bree was slowly being led away by Ava. My eyes found Gabriel, who was staring at me intensely. Don't wait for me tonight. I knew he didn't mean to be cruel. In fact, I knew he only meant that he'd be back quite late. But I couldn't help but wince inwardly at his harsh tone. Gabriel must have seen my slightly wounded expression and he quickly turned away, his face a cold mask as he strode over to the others. The Navi part of me wanted him to follow us, to con me until I fell asleep. I knew I was being childish. To my agent extraordinaire, Madeleine Nobel, heartfelt thanks for your unfailing patience, enthusiasm. One of his pack members had just been brutally murdered. He would have a lot to take care of. The walk back to Gabriel's house was completely silent. The atmosphere was thick with worry and tension, and I glanced over my shoulder in paranoia every few minutes. I couldn't help but feel as if I was being watched. El's shoulders were thick with tension, and I knew he was on full alert. I felt safer in his presence, and I knew Gabriel wouldn't trust just anyone to take me home. But I couldn't shake the feeling. I also couldn't help but wonder if Riley was killed deliberately in front of me. To my agent extraordinaire, Madeleine Nobel, heartfelt thanks for your unfailing patience, enthusiasm. The vampires had definitely taken notice of me for being Gabriel's mate. It all just seemed too coincidental. What bothered me further was that Riley had been killed by a vampire. Had everyone else already known they existed? Had this happened before? I felt goose and stries on my skin as the beetle led me to the front door. There were already 2 burly wolves there, one on each side. Muscular babysitters. Basically, in another situation I would have laughed at the absurdity of it, and at Gabriel's paranoia, but for now I knew it was completely unfounded. I opened the door. The 2 guards there giving me curt nods. I turned to Eli. His dark eyes met mine and held them for a few heartbeats. I saw thinly masked worry and sadness buried in his gaze. I said softly, not knowing how else to convey my feelings. His expression twisted and he turned his head. Take care of yourself, Skylar, was all Eli said before he strode off into the night. I knew he was hurting from the loss of a packmate. I couldn't even imagine the agonizing grief that Riley's family must be feeling. I hurried inside and shut the door, feeling slightly awed as I saw the 2 guard wolves move to stand in front of the entrance. Despite my exhausting day, food did not even sound remotely appetizing. I grabbed a water bottle and hurried upstairs to my bedroom. I had showered this morning, but I was sweaty, and one glance into the mirror almost made me throw up. I still had Riley's blood splattered all over me. Starting up a bath with steaming hot water, I rubbed my tired eyes. Immediately upon closing them, I saw a pair of wide, glassy orbs, blood trickling down a torn throat. I immediately opened my eyes again, feeling another wave of nausea. As I waited for the bathtub to fill up, I quickly stripped all of my clothes off and threw them to the side, vigorously scrubbing my face with cold water from the sink to get the crimson liquid off. I shouldn't be alone right now. I knew that. I couldn't get the scene in the woods out of my head. All jubilation from my earlier fight with Bree was completely gone, and now all I could remember was her broken sobbing over her friend's body. She was a member of one of the deadliest packs on the continent, yet she had cried over a comrade's body like any other. Despite my wariness for the Black Mountains pack, I could respect a pack member's passing. Even after being around Riley for less than half an hour, I could feel their pain. I didn't even want to know what Gabriel was going through. The vampires were after him, for some reason. Was he blaming himself? Was he in pain? My wolf wanted me to comfort him, yet he had pushed me off to the side as usual. I tried to shove all of my twisted thoughts away as I sank into the warm bathwater. Even so, I refused to shut my eyes, afraid of what I might see when they were closed. An hour later, I lay in bed, staring up at the ceiling. Sleep was refusing to come, and I was afraid of dreaming. Part of me wanted to lower my mental barriers and have a conversation with my parents to check up on them, but I was worried that they would see everything inside my head. I couldn't cause them unnecessary worry by telling them about Riley. I would wait until everything calmed down before I warned them about vampires in the area. I would do it as soon as I got my mind under control. I tossed and turned for a while, the nightmares hanging in the fringes of my imagination. My wolf felt agitated, and her mate was not around to soothe her. We needed his company, and I couldn't help but selfishly wish he would come check up on me. Surely his presence alone would help. But since he wasn't here, I bolted up in bed, made my way to the door as the idea came to me. I did not care about the consequences. Enough had happened today that I knew I wouldn't get any sleep if I didn't follow my instinct. I slowly walked down the carpeted hallway, making my way up the staircase and towards the endlessly tempting double doors. As I strode bravely into Gabriel's room, his scent surrounded me and I inhaled deeply. I knew he hadn't been here since early in the morning, but the smell alone was enough to help. I stopped beside his neatly made bed, staring down with preoccupation. Would he mind? I wanted nothing more than to crawl in bed and surround myself with his unique scent. Even though he likely wouldn't be there beside me all night. I knew if he came home he might be agitated that I had gone in without permission. But this is the closest we will be to him. My wolf whined softly. She too was mourning the passing of one of our kind, and she sounded incredibly vulnerable. An idea then came to me, that I thought compromised between soothing my frayed nerves and avoiding Gabriel's agitation after all. It already snooped through his room enough. I strode over to his dresser, opening two drawers before I found his T-shirts. I grabbed the closest one and exited the room quickly. His scent should be enough. Once back in my room, I crawled into bed, sinking into the downy comforter. I took a deep breath, clutching the T-shirt to me. Instantly I felt my frayed nerves relax as his welcoming and familiar scent washed over me. Maybe one day he can soothe us in person, my wolf whispered. I grabbed a fistful of the shirt and moved it to where it was mostly under my head, between my head and the pillow. Maybe, I replied, unable to keep the wistfulness out of my own voice. I continued to breathe deeply as I sank deeper into the bed, significantly more relaxed now. Within a few minutes I was fast asleep. Skylar. I mumbled something incoherent in response to the voice. Warm and comfortable and unwilling to move. Come on, Skylar. Wake up. The voice was more impatient now. Go away. I grumbled, feeling that my bubble of happiness would be popped if I woke up. Skylar. Quite loudly, and my eyes snapped open. For a split second I hoped to see Gabriel, actually coming to check on me, but my hopes were dashed as I made eye contact with Eli. He was crouched next to me, his expression wan and slightly irritated. Why was he in my room? Anyways, realizing I was still clutching Gabriel's T-shirt in one hand and it was very obvious what he'd done, I felt the color rush to my cheeks along with all of the events of the previous night. Eli, what are you doing in here? Mortified, not caring that I was addressing the beta. I felt incredibly disconcerted that he had come all the way up here to wake me up. I knocked on the door 10 times but you didn't wake up. He didn't sound over-apologetic, and his eyes were hooded, barely concealing sadness. The funeral is about to start. You didn't really know him, but I thought you might want to be there. I blinked up at him, surprised by his thoughtfulness. He was going to let me. An outsider. I swallowed the lump in my throat. My sleep had been mostly dreamless, and I knew why. I glanced down at the shirt. I didn't want to return to the cruel reality, but some part of me felt obligated to go. I couldn't shake the concept that I was partially responsible for the young boy's death. I dreaded the look on the pack's faces when I showed up. But if Eli supported me, then there was no reason not to go. Thank you, I said softly. Eli nodded gruffly, then stood up to his full height. You're becoming a member of the pack, and you passed one of the tests. You have a right to be there. He averted his gaze, seemingly uncomfortable with the proximity of a pajama-clad female. You've got 10 minutes. Before striding out of the room, the mood of the pack village was somber as Eli and I walked through. I felt many gazes on me, but thankfully nobody said anything loud enough for me to hear. Although today felt eerily similar to the day before, L's behavior alone was glaringly different. It was customary to have a funeral at night, but I had absolutely no doubt as to the reason why this one was being held at midday. I had been to a human funeral once in high school to support one of my human friends, and I had been struck at the similarities. The ritual after the ceremony, to my agent extraordinaire, Madeleine Nobel, heartfelt thanks for your unfailing patience, enthusiasm, was different as werewolves did not have cemeteries. The ceremonies, however, had much in common. The trek today was nearly an hour long as we ventured through a different part of the woods. Several other wolves crowded in around us as we made our way to a common destination. The sun beamed high in the sky overhead, but I barely noticed the heat. The path ahead of us was somewhat overgrown with ferns and weeds, likely because funerals were not exceedingly common for werewolves. We had extended lifespans and were hard to kill. Trying not to think about it, finally we emerged into a large, grassy clearing. In the middle of the clearing was a long, flat rock that had room for several wolves to lie side by side. Currently the rock only had one occupant, a body swathed in clothes. Where wolf corpses were only covered if the death was brutal, and I was forced to look away. It seemed that the setting for a Black Mountains pack funeral was similar to the few I had been to at home. Most of the funerals I had been to had occurred because of the actions of the pack I was staying with now. I tried not to think about it. Werewolves stood in a gigantic semicircle around the clearing despite the size of the area. Each wolf was almost elbow to elbow as there were so many of us. There was a wide space left between the group and the flat boulder, and only a small group stood on the far side of the rock nearest the body. The wolves parted to let Eli and I through, and I felt many gazes burning into the side of my face. Most of the whispers were not friendly. Not that I could blame them. I was still an outsider to them, as Gabriel and I had not completed the mating process and had not participated in a mating ceremony. I was no Luna yet. Yet, my wolf emphasized. I tried to focus only on the ground in front of me as we approached the far side of the rock. To my agent extraordinaire, Myelin Noble, heartfelt thanks for your unfailing patience, enthusiasm. Eli told me to stay. I shifted uncomfortably as I was forced to nearly touch elbows with a couple of wolves I didn't know. However, I didn't complain. I was the alpha, beta, or part of the family, so I had to stand a distance away from the rock. I looked up tentatively to see Gabriel standing stiffly next to the body. My eyes took him in, reassuring myself of his presence. There were 3 wolves huddled near him that I assumed must be Riley's family. The younger male had been next to his body the night before. I couldn't bear to look at them and see their grief-stricken faces. Gabriel's dark eyes flickered across me briefly before Eli stood next to him, and he turned to the group, beckoning us to be quiet. Then the funeral began. I kept my gaze downward but drank in Gabriel's words as he told Riley's life story, talking about his positive traits and his appetite for adventure. Then each of Riley's family members had a chance to speak. Hearing about Riley from his parents' perspective was difficult. I couldn't imagine how it would feel if he'd known him as a packmate. I tried to keep the tears away as his mother broke down mid-speech, hiccuping into silence as her mate began to comfort her. It was unbearable to witness, and even worsened by the fact that Riley was too small to be exposed at his own ceremony. I hadn't sensed the silent tears of the majority of the pack. I had never been to a funeral for one so young, and I hoped never to repeat the experience. I squeezed my eyes shut as the minutes wore on, trying to keep the gruesome memory of his death from popping unbidden into my brain. Then Gabriel began the blessing. The words were different than in my pack, so I remained silent, thinking my pack's customary words as the Black Mountains pack joined in with Gabriel's voice. After the blessing was finished, an unfamiliar blonde walked forward, hair shimmering in the sunlight. She stood in front of the gathered wolves and began to sing in a clear, strong voice that I was envious of. The song weaved in undoubt, a beautiful haunting melody that spoke of a young life lost too early. I had never heard it before, but it gave me chills. The lonely chords hanging in the air long after she stopped singing them. A few last words were said, and there were several moments of quiet reflection before the pack began to retreat from the clearing. Roaming wolves would leave their lost ones where they died, allowing nature to take over. Werewolves also let nature take her toll, but we allowed the family to take their loved ones to their final resting place. The rest of the pack would return to the village and give Riley's family time to go choose a place to put Riley before allowing the elements to do as they may. They would usually travel for several hours before leaving the body, so that it was less likely for others to come across it later. It was only fair to maintain the balance of life by giving our bodies to nature after we died. As the pack members began to quickly file out, my eyes inevitably found Gabriel. He was speaking quietly with Riley's family while Eli stood by. I was sure if I was supposed to head back to his house or wait for him to join me. I was sure he had a million things to do, but part of me felt that he could use some company. Not that he ever seemed to want it. I sighed internally when I was one of the few left in the clearing. Riley's father came forward and gingerly lifted the small body. I was almost glad it was covered so his family wouldn't have to gaze at the wounds while they carried their son. Riley's mother had tears silently streaming down her face, and another werewolf that was likely Riley's brother was comforting her. Slowly, the three exited the clearing. After another moment, the only three left were Gabriel, Eli, and I. The two slowly walked over, deep in conversation. After a moment my mate's eyes found mine. He looked more tired than I had ever seen him. Exhaustion evident in the manner in which he moved. "There's something I need to do," he said to us, although there was an odd hitch in his voice that made me suspicious of his words. "Eli, take her back." "Yes, Alpha," Eli replied obediently. I stared at Gabriel incredulously. He was just going to walk off again without even talking to me. I felt my frustration building. But I began, feeling as if I was constantly arguing with everything Gabriel said. "I need to be alone for this." Gabriel cut me off, and I felt my stomach drop. He was pushing me off to the side. What had I ever done wrong? He seemed incredibly worn out, and my wolf was snapping at me to comfort him. My instincts were telling me he needed my help. Yet, there he was, giving me the brush off. I stumbled slightly, still staring in disbelief as Eli gently took my arm and began to lead me away. I felt as if I was going to cry all over again as Gabriel turned and vanished into the trees. After a few more seconds I gritted my teeth, stopping mid-step. Eli turned to me in confusion now. I said stubbornly, feeling a bit childish, but I was refusing to do this again. The beta raised his eyebrows. "He keeps pushing me away," I muttered, feeling a surge of anger that I tried desperately to control. My wolf senses that he needs me, but he keeps ignoring me. He drags me here with him, then pushes me away like him nothing. Eli shook his head slowly. "He doesn't know how to let others in." I stared at him, surprised by his honesty. "I'm his mate. He can't keep treating me like him just another wolf. There's a lot about him you don't know." Ellie's expression was deathly serious. "Well, he could just tell me," I argued, feeling worn out from the heavy emotions I'd been experiencing all day. "It isn't that easy. Are you trying to be vague?" Frustrated, I couldn't prevent my irritation from bubbling to the surface. Eli sighed. "Yes, just. In going after him," I stated determinedly. Ellie's look grew perturbed. "Skylar, I don't think that's necessarily," he began cautiously. "He didn't order you in the alpha tone to take me home this time. You can't get in trouble." I was stubbornly refusing to give in. Eli turned completely to face me. "He can be volatile. You might." "I can't do this, Eli. I can't live with a pack that doesn't even know me and a mate that doesn't even like me. If he doesn't want me, he can just tell me himself." My voice rose with each word as my frustration grew. Eli looked taken aback at my outburst, but before he could reply I was already spinning on my heel and dashing towards the trees. He called after me but made no move to follow. I ignored him, knowing I'd have to apologize later but not caring. I had let Gabriel maintain his distance for days now, and my emotions were stretched thin. I was trusting my wolf and not letting him get away this time. How was I supposed to stay here and take a chance on Gabriel if he wouldn't even let me in? I was trying to get over my previous hatred of him and not think of him as the tyrant that had abused my pack. But he was not showing me a good side. I couldn't resist developing feelings because of our mating bond, but he was making it damn near impossible to like him. I followed his scent, dashing somewhat recklessly through the undergrowth as I fought to catch up with him. He must not have been moving too fast, for it didn't take long. I burst out of the copse of trees, coming to an abrupt halt when I saw him. Gabriel was standing at the edge of a small creek, staring down into the water, facing away from me. His posture was stiff, shoulders hunched. He was moving. Every line of his body was tense. I could sense his great agitation. Even though we hadn't completed the mating process, I didn't know him on the intimate level, but the mating bond was growing and I could discern enough to feel a rush of sympathy. He must have heard me and sensed me standing there. But still Gabriel did not move. I took a few tentative steps towards him. I hadn't been sure if I was going to try to talk to him or yell at him, but seeing him this way unnerved me. He had said he wanted to be alone, and I was struck with surprise as I wondered if this was his way of dealing with his grief. I might be intruding, but right now I was probably the only person that could help. Swallowing my misgivings, I approached him until I stood directly behind him. Still, Gabriel remained frozen in place. A few heartbeats passed in silence. "Gabriel," I whispered. My hand itched to reach up and touch his broad shoulder, but I resisted the impulse. I didn't want to make it worse. Broken from his trance, my mate slowly turned around to face me. His expression was hooded, but exhaustion clearly lined his face. His mouth was set in painful resignation. "You should not have followed me." His voice quiet, but there was no anger in it. He seemed more subdued than I'd ever seen him. A muscle in his jaw twitched. I gazed into the depths of his dark eyes, trying to figure out what he was thinking. He tried to mask it, but I saw some emotion deep down. Underneath Gabriel's emotionals' mask, he was in pain. He was grieving for his pack member, but he couldn't show it in front of everyone else. He was always alone. That thought caused a sharp pain to lance through my chest. My wolf whimpered loudly in the back of my mind. I reacted on impulse and my wolf's instinct. I had ignored her urges for a long time now, but for once, I trusted my more animalistic side. He needed me. My mate needed me. I put my arms around Gabriel's waist, wrapping them securely around him. He immediately tensed. Whether in shock or distaste I didn't know, but I ignored his discomfort. I turned my head to the side and rested my cheek against his chest, the warmth of his body touching me through the thin cotton of his shirt. I could feel every muscle as I pressed my body against his butt. For once the lustful impulses remained at bay. I closed my eyes, unsure how exactly it worked, but I attempted to send a warm, soothing feeling from my body into his. I imagined a sensation of complete relaxation, trying to force it through the physical connection of our bodies. I could hear his heart beating, loud and strong, despite the unfamiliarity of the sensation. Right. It was as if a tiny piece of me had fallen into place. I knew in that moment I was completely safe and secure, and I didn't want to move. The feeling of our bodies touching was completely perfect, and I now understood why mates always knew they were destined to be together. Gabriel's arms moved. For a second, I thought he was going to push me away, so I was left reeling with shock when I felt them wrap around me. One of his large hands climbed to the back of my head, fisting in my hair, while the other wrapped securely around my lower back. He lowered his head, resting his chin on top of my head. I actually felt his muscles loosen slightly, the swell of his chest indicating he had taken a deep breath. Through my dreamy haze I still felt shocked that he was responding, and my wolf was completely elated. My heart fluttered rapidly against my rib, but I was sure he could hear it. We remained in that position for a few more seconds, wrapped around each other in silent comfort, before I felt him begin to stiffen again. Just like that, I knew the moment was over. Gabriel let go of me and began to pull away, so I was forced to release him. He took a few steps backwards, and I felt a pang as I saw that his guarded expression was back. He watched me for a few seconds as if he was unsure what to say. Surprise still faintly lingered on his features. I knew my cheeks were tinged pink from our brief interaction. "It's my fault," he finally said, breaking the silence. His tone was monotonous. "How is it your fault?" Puzzled, my voice coming out raspier than intended. I still couldn't shake the feeling of his arms wrapped around me. I wondered if I'd really made a huge breakthrough or if he thought it was a moment of bad judgment. "It's me they want." "Why do they want you?" He averted his gaze, not responding. I felt a twinge of frustration. "You can tell me," I said softly. Gabriel shook his head. "It would be better not to." "Why do you always do that?" He looked at me blankly, so I continued. As soon as I ask something personal, you push me away. Because I don't want to talk about it. Why? Because it's personal. I'm your mate. I can't help you if you don't tell me things. I can't help if you're constantly ignoring me or pushing me away. His expression hardened slightly. I don't ignore you. Yes, you do. My frustration was building all over again. You drag me all the way out here, to a pack that hates me, and then make virtually no effort to try to make me feel welcome or at least get to know me. I sounded petulant, but didn't care at this point. I have packed duties to attend to. I can't be with you constantly. His tone was too cold for my liking. Constantly. You're hardly with me at all. And now you're trying to contain me in my own wing of the house, and not let me leave. You're complaining about my house now. How could be misconstrue my words like that? That's not it, I replied, matching his tone. Someone has to try to keep you safe. As twice now your recklessness has almost gotten you killed. Gabriel said coolly. I bristled. I knew I was only making everything worse by arguing, but I couldn't help it. Everything from the last couple days was getting to me. That's not the point. Then what is your problem? That only made me angrier. I'm angry because come all the way out here and then you barely acknowledge me. You act like you don't even want me. Like you don't care. I tried to force myself to calm down. Is that what you think? His tone condescending. I felt another surge of anger at the way he was speaking to me. It's pretty obvious. I snapped. Gabriel stared at me, remaining silent. I took that as a confirmation. I felt all of the hurt bubble to the surface. If you don't want me or if I'm not good enough, you should have just rejected me from the beginning. At least I would be able to move along and, maybe sometime in the future, try to find someone else instead of being strung along like. Gabriel snarled loudly, effectively cutting me off. There will be nobody else, he growled furiously. I thought I made that abundantly clear. What the hell is wrong with you? I exclaimed, my voice growing shrill. 1 second you're ignoring me and the next you're trying to be all protective and jealous. You can't be both at once. Gabriel's eyes were flashing and his fists were clenched. I couldn't believe this was our second and big argument in just a couple of days. I also felt a small pain of guilt that I was causing him distress on the day of Riley's funeral. The thought caused pain to lance through me. I weakened slightly. This isn't how mates are supposed to be, I said thickly around the lump that was growing in my throat. My voice was lower in my attempt to control myself. You're supposed to want each other. Love each other unconditionally. Wanting you is never the problem, Gabriel said, his voice deep with suppressed agitation. I blinked, momentarily taken aback. Then wits, in doing it for your own good. It's better this way. I stared at him incredulously. Hurting me like this is for my own good, I demanded. Better now than later, he replied straight on ILY. Gaping at him. What the hell did he mean by that? So he did deliberately push me away, but he was trying to avoid causing us pain in the future. I was beyond confused and I could only stare at him blankly. Gabriel sighed, running a hand through his hair in agitation. It's never going to be anything you did. Quieter now. He was clearly trying to control his anger. Because of my bloodline. Enthusiasm, I'm destined to hurt you one day worse than I am hurting you now. He was revealing more than ever before. And I was bewildered. Bloodline. Because of your father. Gabriel stared at me for a long moment, not responding. I held my breath. Speaking about his bloodline reminded me of the pictures I had found in his room and closet. I tried to put the pieces of the puzzle together. With little success. Gabriel's expression was preoccupied, eyes flickering with some unknown emotion. For a moment, I actually thought he would tell me. However, this small burst of hope was quickly squashed as he turned away with resignation. We need to get back to the others, he said quietly. All vestiges of emotion gone. His unfathomable mask had returned. I almost wanted to childishly stamp my foot in frustration. I had come so close to learning more about him. His stiff posture had returned and I could see the tight set of his jaw. I bit my lip, wondering if I had pushed too far. Without waiting for my response, Gabriel began to walk away. I was left with an empty frustration that never seemed to go away when I was in his presence. "Come on," he said tiredly, glancing briefly over his shoulder to assure that I did as asked. I stared for a moment longer before forcing my feet to move. I trailed after him, deep in thought, my mind a jumble of confused thoughts. New determination burned deep inside of me as I stared at his towering form in front of me. Gabriel may think he avoided the difficult questions, but he had only aroused my curiosity even more. After his brief display of affection, I was even more set on figuring him out. My wolf wouldn't have it any other way. I narrowed my eyes and tilted my chin defiantly as we began to make our way back to the rest of the pack. I would get my answers, and I would get them soon. Chapter 14. The next several days were absolutely miserable. Strangely enough, my misery was solely due to the violent images of Riley's death assaulting my mind every time I closed my eyes. While this was definitely an issue, the main cause of my agitation was Gabriel himself. My stubborn, antisocial, over-protective mate kept me locked in his house with no means of escape. He refused to let me leave for any reason, even during the day, and he kept 2 of his wolves constantly on guard at the front door with the alpha command not to let me leave. This was worsened by the fact that Gabriel was hardly at his own home during the day. I was going stir-crazy, and my mood had steadily worsened as the days passed by. The first few days after Riley's funeral, I knew Gabriel and the others were trying to work out the logistics of defense against the vampires, as well as trying to get things settled. So I tried to be patient. I knew they had to organize patrols at all hours of the day. But after that, my patience began to wear thin. I contacted my family a few times to talk with them, shifting in the middle of my bedroom so it was easier to speak to them across the great distance, which I was sure looked comical. I told them the red tag on Gabriel's pack, but I did not supply them with the details. They would go out of their minds with worry. I also conveniently did not tell them that I was basically a prisoner in Gabriel's house. I also read a couple of books to pass the time, but eventually my thoughts would always wander to Gabriel and did get distracted. The one bright light of the miserable experience of being kept inside was the woman who cooked for Gabriel. Evelyn. She showed up every evening to cook dinner for me and leave the leftovers for Gabriel, as he didn't get home until the middle of the night. Gabriel had given her a few days off when I first came back to the pack with him, but clearly he realized that the amount of food was getting scarce. Or perhaps he was worried I would start talking to the wolves because I was so lonely. So every evening she showed up to cook dinner. She was wonderful at it. A tall woman in her mid-60s, Evelyn was one of the only wolves in the pack that treated me kindly. As the days passed after the funeral, I got to know more about her and about the Black Mountains pack. The 5th day after Riley's funeral, I tried to ask her more about Gabriel and his past. For the first time since I'd met her, she looked acutely uncomfortable at the questions and gave very evasive answers. So I didn't press. I didn't want to anger her and lose one of my only friends in the pack. My determination and optimism about retrieving much needed answers from Gabriel was beginning to fade. He was very rarely alone in the house, and few times he was. I got the sense that he was avoiding me. We had very short conversations when we did speak. He knew I was determined to find out what secrets he kept, and he was dead set on hiding them from me as long as possible. My wolf was almost as agitated as I, while our mating bond was strengthening because of our proximity with Gabriel. It was not the natural order of things to resist the pull for so long. Most wolves consummated the bond as soon as possible. Our behavior was unnatural. Any patience I would normally have had was nearly gone. I could scarcely sleep at night because of the horrible recent memories, and the lack of rest was beginning to take its toll. Gabriel had held several meetings downstairs, but I dared not intrude because it would risk a lot of negative attention from his pack. Besides, most of the meetings pertained to patrol strategies and the like. Clearly, most of Gabriel's warriors already knew about the existence of vampires, so were not surprised about the many precautions they were taking. I could not help but wonder why I had been kept in the dark in my pack for so long, especially considering my parents and Alpha Brett had seemed to know about the vampires too. I had overheard one thing when I was grabbing a granola bar from the kitchen while Gabriel was conducting a small meeting in the living room. while vampires could travel fast. Gabriel had said there was no way they could have made it from the nearest town in time to strike, that soon after dark this meant that either one or many of them had a hideout nearby in a cave or some other shelter. The thought was not pleasant. So far, the searchers had found nothing, although I did not admit it out loud. Gabriel's behavior hurt. The rare times when he was around the house, his eyes would find mine briefly before flickering away with an unreadable expression. He often brushed by me with only a short word or two in explanation of where he was going, and the few conversations we did have were short and awkward. I was always asleep before he came back at night and woke up after he left in the morning. He was working himself to death but not seeking my comfort or companionship in any way, and intentionally avoiding any sort of confrontation with me. Every time it happened I felt myself getting closer to a breakdown. A week after Rai's funeral, I had gotten up super early to catch him and finally confronted him about it while he was halfway out the door at 5 in the morning. I had told him that I was suffocating and asked if HED at least let me go outside to train. I must have looked completely insane, or some part of Gabriel knew how poorly he was treating me, because he conceded. To my agent extraordinaire, Madeleine Nilban, heartfelt thanks for your unfailing patience, enthusiasm. Gabriel instructed Delia, one of the other babysitters, to accompany me to the training field in the afternoon. They let me train for a couple hours with the other wolves each day. I was not allowed to patrol, but at least I got to demonstrate my agility and fighting skills. It was still immensely uncomfortable with the way the others treated me, and Gabriel did not once observe my training. Plus, although I was keeping up with his packmates, 2 hours a day was not nearly enough time for me to stretch my legs. If he was going to change his mind about keeping me locked up, I would take matters into my own hands. So on the 12th day after Riley's funeral, I decided I'd had enough. I had to get out of the house no matter what it took. I had begrudgingly followed Gabriel's orders so far, but at this point, I did not care about disobeying him. It had been a week and a half since the funeral, just since I first arrived, and Wade made no progress. He couldn't treat me like an insignificant speck of dirt and expect to get away with it. To my surprise, my wolf factory agreed with me. She wanted to run free for a little while, work the agitation out of her limbs. As soon as Gabriel left for another search, I put my plan in motion. I walked quietly down to the foyer, glancing outside to see that the 2 guards were loitering about in front, looking irritable. They likely thought that guarding Gabriel's mate was a waste of time, but they dare not disobey the alpha. I couldn't blame them. I disagreed with his decision to keep me cooped up like a prisoner. I knew he was trying to protect me in some way, but it was ridiculous. I was not some pet to be caged up, and despite the fact that he was trying to protect me, it was still childish of him to avoid me the very few hours he was around. Assuring myself that they weren't really paying attention, I hurried back upstairs. I slowly walked down the hallway to the 2nd floor, opening doors as I went and peering out of the windows in the rooms. What I really needed was a window near a large, sturdy tree. Shimmying down a tree wouldn't be the world's most graceful exit, but I needed some fresh air before I went crazy. I finally got lucky when I opened the door to the bathroom nearest my bedroom. There was a decent-sized window that I could likely fit through, and it was along the back side of the house, so the guards would be less likely to hear me. I doubted they were alert enough to catch the subtle noise I would make when climbing down the tree. Gripping the ledge of the bottom half of the window, I quickly unlocked the latch and then heaved the window up in one fluid motion. It was a relief to see that there was a thick branch pretty close to the window. I clambered out and onto the branch, having climbed a lot during my childhood years. It wasn't overly difficult. I had Werewolf Grace to thank for that. Trying to be as quiet as possible, I slowly crawled along the branch, dropping to a lower branch once one was near enough. I repeated this action with 2 more branches, eyeing the ground below me with some caution. I was too far up now, and my landing shouldn't make too much noise. I swung myself below the branch and then released it, landing on my feet in the thick grass behind Gabriel's house with a soft thud. I couldn't waste time now. I quickly took off towards the nearest copse of trees, stripping my clothes off and tying them around in record time. I easily welcomed the contortion and burning sensation that the shift brought. It had been too long since I had last shifted. In fact, I hadn't been in this form since I had started living with the Black Mountains pack. My wolf yipped with excitement, stretching her long, powerful legs. "Where should we go?" she asked me, tone lighter than I had heard it in days. "Let's just run for an hour or so. Not so far that we can easily make it back hours before sunset." I was hoping to talk to our pack. The thought of opening my mind and hearing others' voices was a relief. I had been quite lonely the last few days. I took off without further ado, my wolf and I enjoying the breeze whispering through our fur and the thick grass of the forest under our paws. The trees provided shelter from the sun for a few moments before the woods ended, giving way to rockier, hilly ground that the Black Mountains pack was known for. I slowed my pace, treading cautiously around the sharper rocks that would hurt my feet. I began to climb onto large rocks and leap from boulder to boulder, relishing the feel of my wolf's powerful muscles in this form. My human body was just so frail in comparison. We ran like that for just over an hour, having no issue traversing the rougher territory, although some part of me missed the dense forests from closer to home. After a while I instructed my wolf to slow down, and she did so, although regretfully. I waited until we found a large stretch of relatively flat ground overgrown with thick grass before stopping completely. We would probably be here for a while. I turned in a circle, stretching my large form out in the warm sunlight, holding my breath in anticipation. I lowered my mental barriers and stretched tendrils of thought out to my mother and father, leaving the others for later. "Skylar, why haven't we heard from you in days?" As expected, my father was angry. It had been 3 or 4 days since I'd last spoken with them. "Skylar, so glad to hear your voice, sweetie." My mother, after greeting me, attempted to calm him. Typical responses from both of them. "Sorry, Dad," I tried to make my tone as apologetic as possible. Before he could lecture me, I gave a brief explanation of my training during the past couple of days, and how I was holding my own. I didn't include the way Gabriel was treating me. That would only serve to infuriate my father. Once more, I didn't mention the fact that I was cooped up pretty much all day. At this point, I had contacted Alpha Brett to join our mental discussion. I had a question for him, as there was something still bothering me. "I've been wanting to know, why did nobody tell me about the vampires before all of this? I always thought they were a myth." There was silence for a few seconds before my father spoke. "I've only met one once when I was very young. They are rare creatures, rarer than werewolves. It hoped you'd never come into contact with one, never have to know they exist. I advised them not to tell you." Alpha Brett continued where my father had left off. "Same with many of the other families. That's why none of the younger generation knows." I remained quiet for a moment, not sure how I felt about them making this decision for me. Maybe if it had some idea of what waited out there. Now, of course, I realized that it would have been easier for you had you known, Alpha Brett admitted, after several seconds of silence. "Skylar, Gunny, don't blame your father or the Alpha. We argued over it and I thought it best we stay silent. To my agent extraordinaire, Madeline Noban, heartfelt thanks for your unfailing patience, enthusiasm." Now I wish we would have said something. There was a piercing sadness in her tone and I decided to drop it. After half an hour of catching up, I requested to speak to Maria or Will. I knew that it was likely that neither was in Wolfram at the moment, but I hoped they were missing me enough to want to shift for a few minutes. I politely asked Alpha Brett to convey the message, then said goodbye to my parents. Talking to too many wolves at once could be near impossible, especially when I was at this distance. A few minutes later, I felt both of my friends' presences in my mind. My wolf gave a small yip of elation as I realized just how much I had missed them. I had only been able to talk to them once since I left home, and it was over a week ago. "Skylar," Maria said excitedly, and I could sense her excitement even at this distance. Will began to greet me, but his calm voice was drowned out as Maria started grilling me with questions. "How are you? Has anything new happened? How was that mate of yours? Have you guys some?" She stuttered off into awkwardness and Will seemed tense for some reason. "Calm down," Calm down. I'm fine. I've started training with the wolves here. To my agent extraordinaire, Madeleine Nilben. Heartfelt thanks for your unfailing patience, enthusiasm. Frustrating. And no. I gave the last answer shortly. I knew that in human form I would have been betrayed. The conversation continued from there. Although Maria gave considerably more input than Will. It was odd. How it felt like I hadn't seen them in months when it had only been a couple of weeks. It was definitely difficult to be away from the pack you were born into. Maybe it would have been easier if Gabriel was so impossible. After an hour of conversation, my mental barriers were slowly beginning to rise again. I had expended a lot of energy talking to all of them for an extended period of time from this distance. Glancing up, I realized it was afternoon and I needed to return to the pack soon. Hopefully Gabriel wasn't back yet. He'd likely be infuriated that I had passed his guards. I said goodbye to my best friends. My tone tinged with regret. I could only hope I would see them again soon. Take care of yourself. Skylar. Will said softly. I smiled mentally, glad to see that somebody cared, closing off the conversation for good. I stood up and shook my thick silver fur out. It was time to head back to the pack and see what kind of trouble I was in. With any luck, Gabriel would not be home, it was the norm. After all, and I'd be able to sneak back in. I really didn't think this through. I berated myself as I exited the trees behind Gabriel's house in human form again. I could hear Gabriel from this distance, shouting at the guards for letting me slip by. He must have just gotten back. I couldn't help but feel a surge of irritation directed at him. If he had paid attention to me in the first place, I wouldn't have resorted to such extreme measures to make myself feel better. Besides, it wasn't exactly like I was trying to make a grand escape for good. Gabriel's deep yelling abruptly cut off. He must have caught my scent. I hurried around the side of the house, eyes falling upon the exact scene I had constructed in my mind, Gabriel yelling at two downcast guards. One of them flashed me a murderous stare as I walked up. Gabriel was facing me, standing stiffly with his arms crossed in front of his chest and his eyes cold. I felt a spike of pain deep within my chest. He was looking at me as he would any other disobedient member of his pack, whereas I couldn't help feel admiration every time I saw him. I wished for the umpteenth time that he could see me the way a mate was supposed to. You weren't supposed to leave the house, he said icily, anger resounding in his tone. I didn't come here to be a prisoner, I replied shortly, not liking his tone. While part of me was intimidated by his alpha posture, all of my patience had worn thin and I was barely keeping my agitation at bay. I can't constantly keep an eye on you when in dealing with everything else. I gritted my teeth. I don't understand why you think you need to babysit me. I noticed Stilo walking up from the corner of my eye and I blushed with embarrassment. Did Gabriel really have to confront me in front of 3 others? Haven't you noticed what happens every time you wander off? His arms were by his sides now, and he was clenching one of his fists in agitation. Corded veins stood up along his arms, and he was tensed up as if in preparation for an attack. I started to defend myself, but he cut me off. You don't do as you're told. My eyes narrowed. Maybe because you always get into some sort of trouble. You're reckless and impulsive. Again, calling me reckless. I flushed, this time with anger. I felt emotion rising in my chest. I could not believe he was calling me out like this in front of others, talking down to me. I didn't leave just now to try to go get into trouble. I just needed to run after being locked in your house for so long. I made no attempt to mask my growing frustration. Why is it so hard for you to understand that you attract danger? Gabriel ground out through gritted teeth. If I'm such a hazard, maybe you shouldn't have brought me here. I snapped, fury evident in my tone. Gabriel looked away, his jaw clenching, staring off into distance. Then he spoke so quietly, I barely heard it. I wish I didn't. I gasped despite myself, eyes widening. It felt like HED driven, something sharp directly into my chest. For a moment I couldn't breathe. How could he just say something like that? I felt burning at the corners of my eyes and I knew I was dangerously close to crying. I couldn't cry here. I couldn't break down now. I turned away from him. I had to make it back inside the house. Quickly, before emotion took over and I was further humiliated. I began to walk away without another word, trying to fight the rising pain. Rather than saw Gabriel make a move towards me. I turned my head slightly to see him reaching out to try to stop me. I spun around fully then, my wolf snarling in the back of my mind. She was angry with her mate, my angry eyes fixated on his, fury taking over. How dare he make a move to touch me after what he had just said? Don't you fucking come near me. Putting as much venom as I could into every word. Hell hath no fury like a woman scorned. They always said. Well, after being scorned for days and then basically rejected in public, I now knew that to be true. Gabriel recoiled from me, and I thought I saw visible pain flash in his dark eyes before he turned away. I didn't care either way. My wolf was as angry as I, not appreciating the way her fate, given a mate, had insulted her pride. I stormed inside, ignoring everyone else as I slammed the door behind me. I dashed up to my steps and into my room, closing and locking the door. My wolf was whining softly in the back of my mind. The way he had treated us had been insulting the last few days, but never had he come out and said something like that. I wish I didn't. I wish I didn't. I wish I didn't. The words kept running through my mind, blinking rapidly to fight away the tears. I entered my bathroom and started up a hot shower. The last thing I wanted to do was cry, especially if there was a chance he could come up here and overhear me. I was starting to lose this battle. To my agent extraordinaire, Madeleine Nilben, heartfelt thanks for your unfailing patience, enthusiasm. As the water got hot and steam began to escape the confines from the shower, I thought I heard a knocking on the door. Skylar. The baritone was unmistakable. Gabriel was at my bedroom door. I shut the bathroom door nearest me, loudly, so he got the message. I closed my eyes tightly as the pain rose again. I wasn't sure if he was coming to yell at me for snapping at him or coming to apologize. The former seemed more likely, but it didn't matter. I had no desire to talk to him. As far as I was concerned, he has made it apparent that he didn't want me. My wolf whined. Loudly, I stripped off my clothes and stepped into the scalding water, my eyes still burning from unshed tears. I heard knocking again and a muffled voice calling my name. I couldn't care less. He would have to break down the door to talk to me. Hopefully he would respect me enough not to. Although with his recent behavior, that was doubtful. In tears of internal turmoil, I made a decision. I knew it was going to be the most painful thing I had ever gone through in my life. But I was going to have to leave Gabriel. It was apparent that he was too heartless to ever want me or to ever love me. I wasn't sure what exactly I had done to deserve a mate that didn't want me, but that was what I got. I would have to return home to my pack, to the people that cared. All of my previous determination to get to know him was gone. Gabriel had given me absolutely nothing to work with. I slowly slid down the side of the shower until I was sitting, the water pounding against me and traveling in rivulets down my skin to the ceramic tile below. I shut my eyes tightly, feeling the tears gathering. It already felt like something was breaking inside. My wolf felt it too. I could sense it. He hadn't said the words of rejection, but he might as well have. I felt like this whole trip had been a gigantic waste of time. There was no more knocking for the rest of my shower. I climbed into bed about half an hour later, feeling almost completely numb. All of the little rejections and brush offs had just added up to one question: why didn't he just reject me first, instead of stringing me along like this? I should have known all along that what everyone said about him was right. He was just cruel, soulless. In my state of dejection, I blamed fate for giving the impossible task. I'd always thought I was more compassionate than most, but even I couldn't break his shell. I was just going to have to accept that and move on with my life. I fell asleep with all of those disconcerting thoughts whirling through my brain. My tired eyes slowly opened and I blinked, trying to adjust to the lack of light in my room. I frowned in confusion. Why was I awake? To my agent extraordinaire, Madeleine Nilben, heartfelt thanks for your unfailing patience, enthusiasm. It was the dark of night and my room was slightly chilly. I turned to the side, glancing at the clock above my bed. It read 2:58 am. Why the hell was I waking up at this time? My wolf was whining softly in the back of my mind. At first I thought it was because of the event from earlier, with Gabriel, but then I realized it was something else. She was nervous about something. I sat up slowly, rubbing my tired. I shivered slightly. It really was cold in here. At this time of the year it was chilly at night. I frowned again. How had it gotten so cold? I heard a slight rustling noise and I turned to the side, my eyes widening. My window was open. Had I left it open? I didn't remember doing so. I felt a twinge of nervousness and I took a deep breath. There was a strange scent in the air. It almost smelled like blood, and I felt my stomach plummet as my eyes scanned my bedroom with renewed vigor. The air in my room felt different than normal, less stale, as if something had stirred it. It was then that my eyes fell on something at the foot of my bed. A sliver of paper gleamed white, and next to was a medium-sized brown shape that looked like a box or container of some sort. My heart began to pound as I realized that someone had been in my room, that they had likely come through the window I had left open. They had been in here while I had been sleeping and had been quiet enough that I hadn't heard them. The thought was deeply disturbing and I shivered. Not from the cold. I crawled out of bed, the hairs of the back of my neck standing up as my nervousness increased tenfold. Holding my breath as the stench akin to blood increased, I warily approached the items at the foot of my bed. L's point of view, I leaned back in the armchair, attempting to stifle a yawn. We had been at this nearly all night and still there was a pronounced lack of progress. Working with maps and coordinates was not my favorite thing, my wolf, and I would rather be outside patrolling than doing the paperwork. Not I would tell Gabriel that. When he put his mind on something, he doggedly pursued it until he achieved his goal. I glanced up the Alpha, who was brooding examining a map on the table from the chair opposite mine. He had been quiet and sullen tonight. Even for him, I was pretty sure I knew the reason. I could still recall the stricken look on his face as Skylar had walked away from him earlier this evening. I kept my opinions to myself, but after the way she'd reacted towards her, I can't say her reaction was unforeseen. To my agent extraordinaire, Madeleine Noble, heartfelt thanks for your unfailing patience, enthusiasm. Gabriel and I had been friends a long time and had been close growing up, although we'd stopped calling him by his first name out of respect as soon as he became Alpha, despite the fact that he was more withdrawn now than when he was younger. On rare occasions he would confide in me. I had hoped he would talk to me about this, but he was stubbornly keeping his lips sealed. He wasn't used to opening up, that I knew, but if he wasn't careful he would lose her. He might already have. I didn't want to know what would happen to him if Skylar left. This quadrant needs to be searched again, Gabriel was saying, tapping a pen impatiently on an area of the hand, drawn map that he had circled. I leaned forward, examining it. Vincent said he took that quadrant yesterday. I commented. Gabriel shook his head. He drew a line with the pen straight through the middle of the indicated quadrant. He only took this left side. The right side has only been searched once, but not by our best teams. We need to check it again. I nodded. What time tomorrow? Gabriel leaned back again, his expression hooded. He looked exhausted. I'll tell them first thing in the morning. I studied him for a moment. He looked more drawn than I had ever seen him, and there was a grin set to his mouth. If there's nothing left for tonight. To my agent extraordinaire, Madeleine Noble, heartfelt thanks for your unfailing patience, enthusiasm. Maybe you should rest. I knew I was one of the few that could get by with saying something like that. Gabriel made a noise deep in his throat. I don't think that's possible right now. As if on reflex, his eyes flickered up towards the staircase. I hesitated, wanting to say something but completely sure how to approach it. What is it, Eli? Gabriel did not miss my expression. To my agent extraordinaire, Madeleine Noble, heartfelt thanks for your unfailing patience, enthusiasm. Nothing. To my agent extraordinaire, Madeleine Noble, heartfelt thanks for your unfailing patience, enthusiasm. I winced internally. knowing I should have just come out with it. You're not a good liar. I snorted slightly. It was one of our inside jokes. I really was a terrible liar and HED always called me on it. You've seemed a bit tired since. Earlier. I didn't dare elaborate on that, but Gabriel's eyes flashed as he got my meaning. Remaining silent for a few seconds. I hoped I hadn't pushed him. I didn't mean to talk to her like that, he finally said after a moment of silence. His voice was quiet, and there was genuine regret in his tone. I blinked with surprise at the admission. Perhaps this was one of the rare times he was going to talk through his internal struggles. I didn't intend it to end that way. I was just recognizing my own selfishness. His expression had morphed into one almost akin to self-loathing. I know that. Just confused. I muttered half-heartedly, not knowing how to console him. It was true that Skylar didn't have a Gabriel's history. I could see both sides. In her position, I would want to know everything about my future mate, but I could see the various conflicts that Gabriel was presented with. He was having to fight his wolf every step of the way. I want to tell her, Gabriel said abruptly. He seemed almost uncomfortable that he was being so forthcoming. That she'll be even angrier after I do. I shook my head. You don't know that for sure. Gabriel sighed, rubbing his temples as if he had a headache. I was thinking about taking her with me to visit Raziel. I tried to hide my surprise. I knew Gabriel was considering paying Raziel a visit, as he might be the only one who had the answers we needed about the vampires. If Gabriel was willing to take Skylar along, that would mean he had decided to tell her. I think that would be a good thing, I replied, trying to keep my answer fairly neutral. I really did like Skylar. She was tenacious and had a big heart. It was about time for Gabriel to let her in. Gabriel narrowed his eyes in silent contemplation. I didn't press him any further, as HE'd already been surprisingly forthcoming. He shifted position as if he were about to say something when a loud sound cut him off. It was a horrified shriek, coming from the upstairs bedroom. Skylar, Gabriel muttered, an overwhelming expression of worry and concern crossing his features. In an instant he had leapt out of his chair and was hurtling up the stairs, trying to get to his mate as fast as possible. I stood up and followed him, feeling a twinge of worry myself. Skylar didn't seem to be the type to be easily spooked. I took the stairs two at a time, rushing into Skylar's room immediately after he did. The brunette was huddled in the corner of the room, staring with a horrified expression at something Gabriel's figure was hiding from my view. Gabriel glanced at whatever it was before his shoulders stiffened, and he quickly darted over to his mate. My eyes sought out whatever it was on the bed. It looked like a small slip of paper and a brown box. Cautiously sniffing the air, I walked over to the objects. My body instantly became on full, alert as I caught the scent of blood. Whatever was in that box smelled absolutely foul. Did you open it? Gabriel was asking. He was gripping Skylar's arms and staring at her intently, almost numbly. She nodded. I could see disgust evident in her blue eyes. I gently picked up the slip of paper and read it aloud, my horror growing with each word. You look lovely when you sleep. Thought you might want this as a reminder. With great trepidation, I picked up the box. It was surprisingly light, although I was sure what I expected to be in it. Gabriel had turned and was staring at the box with an unreadable expression, still gripping Skylar's arms. Although his hold was gentle, he shifted slightly to block her view of the box. Open it, he commanded, holding my breath. I undid the latch on the outside of the box and slid the lid open. My stomach plummeted as I saw the box's content. Inside was a rotting, bloody chunk of remains that I quickly determined to be the heart of a werewolf. I knew instantly who it had belonged to. Riley. The stench of blood grew thick in the air as I dropped the box, snarling with disgust. The horrible smell of old blood and decomposition was nearly overwhelming, especially now that the box had been opened. I quickly backed away, trying to fight the bile that was rising in my throat. Who the hell? I began, feeling my fury rise. Vampires. Gabriel spit out the word with disgust. They came in here and put this on her bed while she was sleeping. He glanced down at Skylar. who just stood there frozen, thankfully unable to see the contents again because of her mate's hulking figure. Gabriel's expression was dark and murderous, and he was clearly trying to restrain himself from tearing after the culprit. I couldn't blame him. One of our worst enemies has snuck right in here, in the middle of the night, into his mate's room, trying to regain control of my emotions. The thought of a vampire slithering in here while an innocent girl was sleeping was vile and disgusting. It was also disgusting that the vampire had been carrying that rotting heart around for nearly 2 weeks, just to torment Skylar. What are we going to do? Attempted to keep my voice level. The box now lay on the ground, half opened, a faint glistening sliver of the organ still visible. I turned away so I wouldn't heave. Gabriel's jaw was set. I know we discussed this as an option before, but now I see no other alternative. We need answers, and it's even more urgent now. I'm not sure how a vampire could have gotten in here completely unheard by any of us. Closing his eyes for a brief second, as if he was having a mental battle, he let go of Skylar's arms, stepping a bit away to give her some space as he'd nearly been pressed up against her. I noticed out of the corner of my eye that Skylar shuffled closer to him almost unwittingly, seeking the comfort of her mate. Her eyes were looking anywhere but at the box, although I could tell that she was trying to keep a straight face and regain control of her emotions. I couldn't imagine how she must be feeling right now, with a sick monster watching her sleep. The thought gave me unpleasant goosebumps and made my stomach lurch. My wolf, too, recoiled at the thought. Gabriel's dark eyes opened again, and I knew he'd made a decision. Skylar slowly looked up at him in dazed expectation. I'm going to see Raziel, and I'm taking Skylar with me.